There are moments in nursing that change everything you thought you knew about medicine. Nights when textbooks fail you, protocols mean nothing, and you're left with nothing but instinct and a memory from your past. I'm about to tell you about the night a veteran screamed that he was dying, when every standard procedure failed, and when I had to reach back to something my grandfather taught me decades ago. Something the military knew, but hospitals had forgotten. This is my story, and I lived every second of it. My name is Helen Bradshaw, and I've been an emergency room nurse for 12 years here in Phoenix, Arizona. The desert heat outside is relentless, but nothing compared to the intensity inside those hospital walls. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where my grandfather, a Korean War veteran, raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. He taught me resilience, discipline, and something else I didn't understand. Until much later, techniques he learned in combat that had nothing to do with weapons. I moved to Phoenix right after nursing school, drawn by the promise of a busy trauma center where I could make a real difference. The city was overwhelming at first, all sprawling highways and endless strip malls under that brutal sun. But the emergency room became my home. Night shifts were my specialty. That's when the real cases came in, when the chaos reached its peak, and when I felt most alive. It was a Thursday night in late September when Frank Delacroix arrived. The ambulance call came in around 11 p.m. Male, 72 years old, severe anxiety attack, possible cardiac event. When the paramedics wheeled him through those doors, I knew immediately this was different. He wasn't just scared, he was somewhere else entirely. If this story has already grabbed you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? I want to know who's following this journey with me. Frank was thrashing against the gurney straps, his eyes wild and unfocused. But what struck me most was what he was screaming. Not help me or I'm dying, the usual panic phrases we hear. He was yelling coordinates, military grid references, and names I didn't recognize. Charlie's in the wire. We need extraction now. Donovan's hit. Donovan's bleeding out. His vitals were elevated but not critical. Heart rate 130, blood pressure 160/95, oxygen saturation 94%. Physically, he wasn't dying, but his mind was convinced he was back in Vietnam, somewhere in the jungle, watching his friends die all over again. Our attending physician, Dr. Richards, ordered Ativan to calm him down. We administered 2 milligrams intravenously. Nothing. Frank kept screaming, kept fighting the restraint so hard that his wrists started bleeding. We tried another 2 milligrams. Still nothing. Dr. Richards was frustrated, barking orders for stronger sedation, but I hesitated. I'd seen this before, not in the hospital, but at home. My grandfather used to have episodes, nights when he'd wake up screaming about Inchon, about frozen ground and mortar fire, and I remembered what never worked: sedation. It only made him more agitated, more lost in the memory. I approached Frank's bedside, ignoring the chaos around me. His eyes were glazed, but I could see the terror beneath. This wasn't a medical emergency in the traditional sense. This was a soul trapped in a moment 50 years ago, and no drug was going to bring him back. Thank you for staying with me this far. That shows you feel what I felt when I lived through all of this. So go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell, because what comes next changes everything. I pulled Dr. Richards aside. We need to try something different, I told him. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. We're following protocol, Helen. I know, but protocol isn't working. He's not having a panic attack. He's having a full PTSD flashback. We need to ground him, not sedate him. Dr. Richards was skeptical, but Frank's condition wasn't improving, and the stronger sedatives carried serious risks for someone his age. He gave me 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, to try whatever unconventional approach I had in mind. I took it. I went back to Frank's bedside and did something that went against every instinct we're trained with in nursing. I didn't try to soothe him. I didn't speak softly or tell him everything was okay. Instead, I stood directly in his line of sight, squared my shoulders, and used a command voice. Soldier, I need you to focus on my voice. This is your commanding officer speaking. You are not in Vietnam. You are in Phoenix, Arizona, United States. The year is 2023. You are safe. You are home. Nothing. He kept screaming, but I didn't stop. I remembered what my grandfather told me about grounding techniques they used in Korea when soldiers would freeze up or spiral into panic during combat. It wasn't about being gentle. It was about giving the mind something solid to grab onto, a lifeline back to reality. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, maintaining steady pressure. Sergeant Delacroix, I said, using his rank that I'd seen on his veteran affairs card in his wallet. I need you to tell me 5 things you can see right now. Right now, Sergeant. 5 things. His screaming faltered. Just for a second, but it faltered. I had his attention, even if just barely. I kept going, using the same steady, authoritative tone. 5 things you can see, Sergeant. Name them for me. His eyes started to focus, darting around the room, fighting between the jungle in his mind and the hospital room in front of him. Lights, he finally gasped. Ceiling lights. Good, I said. That's 1. 4 more. Keep going. You're doing good, soldier. This technique, sensory grounding, grounding combined with military command structure was something my grandfather learned from a field medic in Korea. When a soldier couldn't escape a traumatic memory, you didn't baby them. You gave them orders, structure, something their training could latch onto even when their mind was chaos. It worked because military discipline runs deep. Deeper than panic, deeper than trauma. White walls, Frank continued, his voice still shaking but clearer. Curtain, blue curtain. That's 3, I confirmed. 2 more. Come on, Sergeant. Your unit needs you present. Monitors, he said, his breathing starting to slow. Numbers on monitors. And you, he added, finally making real eye contact with me. A nurse. You're a nurse. Exactly right, I told him. You're in a hospital. You're safe. Now I need 4 things you can touch. Tell me what you feel right now. He moved his hand slowly, feeling the gurney beneath him, the thin hospital blanket, the IV line in his arm. Bed, he said. Blanket, plastic tube, my watch. He touched the old military watch on his wrist, a reflex, something real and familiar. His heart rate on the monitor had dropped to 100. His breathing was steadier. The technique was working, pulling him out of Vietnam minute by minute, sense by sense. But I could see something else in his eyes now, not just fear, but shame and pain, deep, old pain that had nothing to do with his body. Basi Hunter Frank was back in the present, but barely holding on. His hands trembled as he touched his face, feeling the wrinkles, the age, confirming he wasn't 22 anymore. Where? He started, his voice cracking. Where am I? Phoenix Regional Hospital, I told him gently, my tone shifting now from commander to caregiver. You're in Arizona. You had a severe panic attack. Do you remember what triggered it? He closed his eyes, and I saw tears squeeze out from beneath his lids. It was a sound, he whispered. Car backfiring outside my house. Just a sound. But suddenly I was back there, back in the mud, back with Donovan. I stayed quiet, giving him space. Sometimes the most important thing a nurse can do is simply listen. Frank opened his eyes and looked directly at me, with an intensity that made my breath catch. Do you know what it's like? He asked. To owe someone your life and never get to say thank you? To watch them die, saving you, and spend 50 years wondering if you deserved it? His voice broke completely. I never told anyone. Not my wife, not my kids, not the VA therapists. I just buried it, and it's been killing me ever since. The monitors showed his vitals stabilizing, but his emotional state was fractured wide open. This was the real crisis. Not medical, but moral, spiritual. A wound that had festered for half a century. Frank told me that on March 17th, 1969, his platoon was ambushed near Da Nang. He was hit in the leg, couldn't move, certain he was about to die. And then Private Marcus Donovan, just 19 years old, ran through enemy fire to drag him to safety. Donovan took 3 bullets doing it, Frank continued, his voice hollow. He died before the medevac arrived. Died with his hand on my chest, telling me I'd be okay, and I never even thanked him, never found his family, never told them what he did. I just came home, pretended to be fine, and lived with this guilt every single day. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this story from? Write it in the comments. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. And if you're feeling this story, hit that subscribe button, because there's so much more to come. The emergency room had quieted down around us. Dr. Richards checked in briefly, saw that Frank was stable, and gave me a nod of approval before moving to other patients. I pulled up a chair next to Frank's bed. This wasn't standard procedure, spending this much time with one patient when others needed care, but I knew this moment mattered more than any chart or protocol. Frank continued talking. The floodgates opened after 50 years of silence. He told me about the letters he wrote to Donovan's family but never sent, dozens of them, all sitting in a box in his garage. He described how every Veterans Day and Memorial Day became torture, how he avoided veteran gatherings because facing other soldiers made the guilt unbearable, how his wife Nancy noticed he'd wake up screaming but he always brushed it off as bad dreams, nothing serious. His children, 3 of them, all grown now with families of their own, had no idea their father carried this burden. To them, he was just dad, a little quiet maybe, a little distant at times, but overall a good man who worked hard as an electrician and provided for his family. They had no clue that every day he woke up wondering if Marcus, Donovan's family, hated him, blamed him, wished it had been Frank who died instead. The shame wasn't just about surviving, Frank explained. It was about thriving. He had a good life, a beautiful wife, successful kids, grandchildren who adored him. Every good thing felt like theft, something stolen from Donovan who never got to experience any of it. How do you enjoy your daughter's wedding when the kid who saved you never got married? How do you hold your grandchildren when he never held his own? Children. I felt tears in my own eyes listening to him. This is what trauma really looks like. Not dramatic or obvious, but quiet and corrosive, eating away at someone from the inside for decades. And I realized that tonight's episode wasn't random. It was a breaking point. His mind and body finally refusing to carry this weight alone anymore. I asked Frank if his family knew he was here, and he shook his head. "They think I'm at a card game with friends," he admitted. I didn't want to worry Nancy. She's got enough to deal with. That statement told me everything. Even now, even after this crisis, Frank's instinct was to hide, to protect everyone from his pain by suffering alone. With his permission, I called his wife. Nancy Delacroix answered on the second ring, her voice immediately tight with worry. She knew, maybe not the details, but she knew something had been wrong for their entire marriage. When I explained where Frank was, and that he was physically okay, but had experienced a severe PTSD episode, there was a long silence. Then she said something that broke my heart. "I've been waiting 50 years for this phone call." Nancy arrived 30 minutes later, a small woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen a lifetime of quiet concern. When she entered Frank's room, he couldn't look at her at first, but she walked right up to him, took his face in her hands and said, "It's about Vietnam, isn't it?" "It's always been about Vietnam." He nodded, and she held him while he cried. Really cried, maybe for the first time since 1969. I gave them privacy, but stayed nearby. When Nancy finally came out to talk with me, she explained that Frank had always been haunted. She knew he'd seen combat, lost friends, but he refused to discuss it. Over the years, she'd learned to navigate around his triggers, the sudden mood changes, the nightmares, the way certain sounds or smells would make him disappear inside himself for hours. She'd begged him to get help, to talk to someone, but he always insisted he was fine. Nancy asked me the question I'd been expecting. Why now? Why did it all come crashing down tonight after so many years? I explained what I knew about PTSD, about how trauma doesn't heal with time unless it's processed, how it accumulates until something, anything, becomes the final straw. A car backfiring, a smell, a random thought. The mind can only compartmentalize for so long. Sam. Over the next few hours, with Nancy's support, Frank made a decision that would change everything. He wanted to find Marcus Donovan's family. He needed to tell them what their son, their brother, their family member had done. He needed to finally say thank you, even if it was 50 years too late. Nancy supported him completely, even though I could see this revelation hurt her too, understanding just how much her husband had hidden, how much he'd suffered, alone. I helped Frank contact the hospital's social worker and a veterans advocacy group that specialized in connecting families of fallen soldiers. The process was surprisingly straightforward. Marcus Donovan's name was on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. His family, or what remained of it, was locatable. Within 2 days, we had contact information for Marcus's younger sister, Teresa Donovan Murphy, who lived in Baltimore. Frank spent those 2 days in the hospital, not because he was medically unstable, but because he needed time to prepare, to work with a trauma counselor, to find the words he'd been unable to say for half a century. I visited him during my shifts, and I watched him transform. The weight was still there, the guilt hadn't vanished, but he was no longer carrying it alone. That made all the difference. When Frank finally called Teresa Murphy, I was in the room at his request. He needed someone there, a witness, support. I'm not sure what exactly, but I stayed. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello?" Frank took a shaky breath. "Mrs. Murphy, my name is Frank Delacroix. I served with your brother Marcus in Vietnam." There was a pause, then a soft gasp. "You knew Marcus?" What followed was one of the most powerful conversations I've ever witnessed. Frank told Teresa everything. How Marcus saved his life, how he'd carried guilt for 50 years, how he should have reached out sooner but couldn't find the courage. And Teresa, crying openly on the other end of the line, told Frank something he never expected. She said, "We always wondered about you." Teresa explained that the Army had notified her family that Marcus died saving a fellow soldier, but they'd never received details about who or what exactly happened. For 50 years, she and her elderly mother, now 94, and in a nursing home, had wondered about the man Marcus died for. They'd imagined him, prayed for him, hoped he'd lived a good life, that Marcus's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. And here Frank was, carrying guilt and shame when Teresa's family had only gratitude and curiosity. She wanted to meet him. More than that, she wanted Frank to meet her mother, Marcus's mother, before it was too late. They arranged a meeting for the following month. Frank and Nancy would fly to Baltimore, visit the family, and finally, after 5 decades, Frank would close this circle of grief and gratitude that had defined his entire adult life. But back at the hospital, I faced consequences for my unconventional approach. Dr. Richards pulled me aside a few days later, not to praise me, but to question my methods. "Helen, what you did with Delacroix worked, but it wasn't protocol. You took a risk, and if it had gone wrong, this hospital could have faced serious liability. You can't just make up treatments based on personal experience. He was right, technically, but he was also wrong in the way that protocols can be wrong. Medicine isn't just algorithms and procedures. It's about seeing the person in front of you and responding to what they actually need, not just what the textbook says they need. I'd watched Frank spiral deeper while we followed protocol. My so-called unconventional method brought him back and potentially saved his life in a way that sedatives never could have. Other nurses had mixed reactions too. Some thought I was reckless. Others admitted they'd felt trapped by protocol before, wanting to try something different but too afraid of the consequences. One veteran nurse, Sandra, who'd worked in field hospitals during Desert Storm, pulled me aside and told me I'd done exactly the right thing. She'd seen the same grounding techniques used in combat medicine, and she respected that I trusted my instincts. 3 months later, I received a letter at the hospital. It was from Frank Delacroix, handwritten on old-fashioned, stationery, the kind nobody uses anymore. He wrote about his trip to Baltimore, about meeting Teresa and her family, about the hours they spent sharing stories about Marcus, crying and laughing together. He described visiting Marcus's grave for the first time, placing his hand on the headstone, and finally saying the words he'd needed to say for 50 years. "Thank you, brother. I'm sorry it took me so long." But the most powerful part of the letter was about meeting Marcus's mother, Rose Donovan, 94 years old and frail, but sharp as ever. Frank had been terrified of that meeting, convinced she'd blame him or resent him. Instead, Rose took his hands in hers and said, "My Marcus would be so happy to know you're okay. That's all he ever wanted, to keep his friend safe. You gave my son's death meaning by living a good life. Thank you for that gift." Frank wrote that something broke open in him at those words, 50 years of guilt cracking apart, not disappearing but transforming into something he could carry differently. He still had PTSD, still went to therapy, still had hard days, but he wasn't alone with it anymore. His family knew, the Donovan family knew, and that made all the difference. He ended the letter thanking me, not just for the grounding technique that brought him back that night, but for seeing him, really seeing him when he was lost, for trusting something unconventional when conventional medicine failed, for reminding him that healing isn't always about following the rules. Sometimes it's about remembering our humanity. I keep that letter in my locker at work. On the hardest shifts, when protocols feel suffocating and I wonder if any of this matters, I read it again. It reminds me why I became a nurse. Not to follow checklists, but to actually help people heal in whatever way they need. Frank's story changed how I practice nursing. I'm more willing to trust my instincts now, to listen to what my gut tells me about a patient, even when it contradicts standard procedure. I've used variations of that grounding technique with other PTSD patients, always adapting it to their specific needs, and it's worked more times than not. The human mind is complex, and sometimes the key to unlocking it isn't in a medical textbook, but in our shared human experience, in the wisdom passed down from those who came before us. My grandfather died when I was 23, before I became a nurse, before I understood how valuable his stories and techniques really were. But that night with Frank, I felt my grandfather's presence, his knowledge flowing through me, proving that the lessons we learn from our loved ones never really leave us. They stay dormant until the exact moment we need them most. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced trauma that you carried in silence? Do you think medicine should make more room for unconventional approaches when standard protocols fail? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please subscribe to this channel for more real nursing stories that go beyond the textbooks. And don't forget to watch the next recommended video, where another nurse shares how she saved a life using nothing but intuition and courage. These stories matter. Your story matters. Thank you for being here with me.